There is a move in football so elegant and so impossible that for years coaches insisted it could not be taught, that it belonged to one man alone, and that man had invented it by accident in a moment of pure desperation. But the truth buried beneath that legend is far stranger, because the man who changed football forever almost never made it to a professional pitch at all. Amsterdam in the 1940s and 50s was a city still finding its feet after war, and the neighborhood of Betondorp was one of its most modest corners. Rows of identical gray concrete houses built to house the working poor. It was here, in the shadow of a famous Amsterdam football stadium he could see from his street but could rarely afford to enter, that a boy with impossibly long legs and an unusual mind began to understand the game differently from everyone around him. He would later say that football for him was not a sport but a language, the only language where the sentences he formed in his head could actually be spoken out loud. His mother worked at that very stadium as a cleaner, which gave him something more valuable than a ticket. It gave him access to the club itself, and to a talent scout who would one day change the direction of his life. He was enrolled in the youth academy of the Great Amsterdam Club while still very young, and from the very first session it was obvious he was not quite like the other boys, not because of his speed or his strength, but because of something almost uncanny in the way he read what was about to happen. But talent in a working-class family in post-war Amsterdam did not come without cost. And when his father died of a heart attack while the boy was still a teenager, the weight of that loss would stay with him in ways that even those closest to him would not fully understand for decades. Grief, it turned out, did not slow him down. It made him more urgent, as if every match was borrowed time he had to fill completely. If you have ever felt that a story this raw deserved to be told properly, this channel exists for exactly that reason. Follow Football Untold and never miss the stories that the record books left out. His early years in the first team were not the effortless ascent the mythology would later suggest. He was too thin, coaches worried he was too fragile for top-level football, and his habit of talking back to authority figures made him as many enemies as admirers. He was opinionated in an era when footballers were expected to run where they were told and say nothing, and that combination of brilliance and stubbornness meant his path to greatness would be neither smooth nor simple. And then, almost without warning, everything clicked, and Dutch football would never look the same again. Under a visionary Dutch coach who believed that the entire pitch belonged to every player at all times, the Amsterdam club began playing a style of football so fluid and so aggressive that opponents struggled simply to understand what they were watching. Total football, as it would come to be known, was not just a tactical system. It was a philosophical statement that every boundary in football, including the boundary of what a footballer was permitted to think and decide for himself, was artificial and should be destroyed. He won the European Cup 3 times with his Amsterdam club in the early 1970s, and those victories were not just trophies, they were proof that an idea could defeat power, that intelligence could defeat muscle. But the moment that would truly define his name to the world came in the summer of 1974, when the Netherlands arrived at the World Cup in West Germany and declared, without saying a single word, that they intended to reinvent international football entirely. The Dutch tore through their opposition with a ferocity and elegance that left journalists searching for new words. Brazil, Argentina, East Germany, all swept aside by a team that seemed to play football from a dimension the others had not yet reached. And then came the moment, the single most iconic piece of individual skill the tournament had ever seen, executed in the 67th minute against Sweden, when the lean number 14 faked one way and then dragged the ball in the exact opposite direction in a single fluid motion so fast and so complete that the defender was left facing the wrong way entirely. The world called it the Cruyff turn, and it was not merely a trick. It was a moment of football philosophy made physical, a statement that the game existed in time and space and the man who understood both better than his opponent would always find a way through. The Netherlands reached the final of that World Cup against the host nation, and in the second minute before the opposing team had even touched the ball, the Dutch won a penalty and it seemed as though the ultimate prize was inevitable. They lost the final, and to this day football historians argue about how, whether it was complacency, the weight of occasion, or simply a night when the footballing gods decided that the most beautiful team did not have to be the champion to change everything. He moved to the famous Spanish club and transformed an institution that had spent years in the shadow of its great rival, almost single-handedly dragging them back into relevance with performances that made the Nou Camp feel like his personal stage. But in 1978, He made a decision that shocked the world. He refused to go to the World Cup in Argentina, citing the brutal military dictatorship that was hosting it, and in doing so he chose conscience over legacy in a way that no footballer of his stature had ever done before. Then his heart nearly stopped him entirely. In 1991, after years of heavy smoking that had shadowed his genius, he suffered a serious heart attack that required bypass surgery, and the man who had always moved faster than the world around him was forced to stop completely and confront his own mortality. He quit smoking the day he woke up from surgery and never touched a cigarette again, but more than that, he returned to football with a new clarity, not as a player this time, but as a manager, and what he built as a manager at his beloved Barcelona would be the second and perhaps greater revolution of his life. The dream team he created at Barcelona in the late 1980s and early 1990s won 4 consecutive Spanish league titles and a European Cup, but more enduring than any trophy was the philosophy he installed in the academy that would later produce some of the greatest players the game has ever seen. The small children who ran through that academy in the 90s following the philosophy he had designed, play short, play smart, dominate through the ball not around it, would grow up to win everything the sport had to offer, and every title they lifted carried his fingerprints. He died in March of 2016, and the tributes that came from every corner of football were not simply for a great player or a successful manager. They were for someone who had fundamentally altered the way the game thinks about itself. Football without his influence is not football as we know it. Every tiki-taka moment, every high press, every number 9 who drops into midfield, every goalkeeper who passes instead of kicks, carries something of a skinny boy from a concrete Amsterdam neighborhood who simply refused to accept the limits the game had drawn around itself. And if stories like this deserve to live on, then Football Untold is where you will always find them.